If the cylinder bores are glazed but otherwise serviceable, lightly break the glaze with a hone using a ball-type or self-centering honing tool. Deglazing should be done only to remove any deposits that may have formed. Use a 240 grit stone of silicon carbide or an equivalent material when performing the deglazing procedure. The honing stones must be clean, sharp, and straight. Move the hone slowly up and down to produce a 45-degree cross-hatch pattern. Clean the bore thoroughly with soap and water. Dry the bore. Rub clean engine oil in the bore. Remeasure the bore. If honing is not required, clean the cylinder bores with hot water and detergent. Dry the bore and apply clean engine oil. If the cylinder is out of specification, the cylinder bore may be oversized to 0.25 millimeters or 0.010 of an inch. There is only one size of oversized pistons and rings available for service. Next, clean the crankshaft with solvent. Thoroughly clean all oil passages and inspect for restrictions and burrs. Dry the crankshaft with compressed air and perform a visual inspection for damage. Use care when handling the crankshaft. Avoid damage to the bearing surface or lobes of the crankshaft position reluctor ring. Damage to the teeth may affect engine performance. The crankshaft position reluctor ring may be replaced if damaged. With the crankshaft on wooden V-blocks, inspect the crankshaft journals for wear. The journals should be smooth with no signs of scoring, pitting, or embedded material. Then measure the crankshaft journals for out of round and taper and excessive runout. Replace the crankshaft if the measurements are not within specification. Disassemble the 5-piston rings by using a suitable tool to expand the rings. Be sure to handle them carefully as worn piston rings are sharp and may cause bodily harm. Note that piston rings must not be reused. There are 2 retainers that hold the piston in place. Remove the piston pin retainers using the specified remover. No special tools are required to remove the piston pins. Ensure that the piston pin is not damaged. Do not reuse the retainers. Remove the piston pin and connecting rod from the piston. With the connecting rods cleaned and dried, inspect the connecting rods for signs of being twisted, bent, nicked, or cracked, and for scratches or abrasions on the rod bearing seating surface. If the connecting rod bores contain minor scratches or abrasions, clean the bores in a circular direction with a light emery paper. Do not scrape the rod or rod cap. If the beam of the rod is scratched or has other damage, replace the connecting rod. Measure the piston pin to connecting rod bore. Using an outside micrometer, measure the connecting rod piston pin. Using an inside micrometer, measure the piston pin bore. Subtract the piston pin diameter from the piston pin bore diameter. The clearance should not be more than 0.021 millimeters or 0.8/10,000ths of an inch. If there is excessive clearance, replace the piston pin. If after replacing the pin there is still excessive clearance, replace the connecting rod. Clean the piston skirts and pins with a cleaning solvent. Do not use a wire brush on any part of the piston. Clean the piston ring grooves with a groove cleaner. Make sure the oil ring holes and slots are clean. Inspect pistons for cracked ring lands, skirts or pin bosses, nicks or burrs on the ring grooves, warped or worn ring lands, eroded areas at the top of the pistons, scuffed or damaged skirts, and worn piston pin bores. Replace pistons that show signs of any wear. Measure the piston pin bore to piston pin clearances. Ensure the piston pin bores and pins are free of varnish. Using an outside micrometer, measure the piston pin in the piston contact areas. Subtract the measurement of the piston pin bore from the piston pin. The clearance should be within 0.002 to 0.012 millimeters, or 7/100,000ths to 47/100,000ths of an inch. If the clearance is excessive, determine which component is out of specification. Place the piston ring in the area of the bore where the piston ring will travel, approximately 25 millimeters or 1 inch down from the deck surface. Be sure the ring is square with the cylinder bore by positioning the ring with the piston head. Measure the end gap of the piston ring with feeler gauges. If the clearance exceeds specifications, the piston rings must be replaced. Repeat this procedure for all of the piston rings. Roll the piston ring entirely around the piston ring groove. If any binding is present, the piston ring is distorted and must be replaced. With the ring on the piston, use feeler gauges to check the clearance at multiple locations. If the clearance is greater than specifications, replace the piston ring. If the new ring does not help it meet specifications, replace the piston. Measure piston width by using an outside micrometer. Measure the width of the piston 14.5 millimeters or 57/100ths of an inch above the bottom of the piston skirt at the thrust surface perpendicular to the center line of the piston pin. Compare the measurement of the piston to its original cylinder by subtracting the piston width from the cylinder diameter. Using the cylinder the piston came from, ensure the piston does not exceed specification. If the clearance is excessive, replace the piston. A used piston and pin set may be reinstalled if, after cleaning and inspection, they are within specifications. Mark the top of the piston using a permanent marker for installation to the proper cylinder. The cast boss on the underside of the piston must go to the rear of the block. Install the piston onto the connecting rod with the arrow on top of the piston pointing towards the front of the engine. The larger feature at the split line located on one side of the connecting rod must go to the front of the block. With the piston pin, connecting rod, and piston coated with oil, assemble the connecting rod to the piston. Install both piston pin retaining rings into the retaining groove using the specified installer. It may help to rotate the retainer until it is fully seated in the groove. Install the following components on the piston: the oil control rings, the lower compression ring with the manufacturer's mark facing upwards, the upper compression ring. Be careful not to expand the rings more than necessary. When any internal engine parts are serviced, care and cleanliness are important, as dirt and debris can cause damage to an engine. A liberal coating of engine oil or specified assembly lubricant should be applied to friction areas during assembly in order to protect and lubricate the surfaces on initial operation. Throughout this section, it should be understood that proper cleaning and protection of machined surfaces and friction areas are part of the repair procedure. Apply the specified sealant to all plugs before installation. Install the coolant jacket plugs and tighten to specification. Then install the oil passage plugs. Then install the piston oil nozzle assembly to specification if equipped. If crankshaft failure is due to conditions other than normal wear, inspect the connecting rod bearing bores and crankshaft main bearing bores. To do this, tighten the bed plate to specifications using the specified angle meter. Measure the bearing clearance to determine the correct replacement bearing insert size. Install the lower crankcase and tighten the bearing cap bolts to specification. Then measure the bearing bore for taper and out of round using a telescoping gauge by measuring the crankshaft bearing journal and inside diameter in several places 90 degrees apart, and average the measurements. Subtract the journal diameter measurement from the inside diameter measurement to determine clearance. No taper or out of round should exist. If out of specification, choose different bearing inserts. Then measure the connecting rod inside diameter in the same direction as the length of rod and the crankshaft main bearing diameter. Next, install the upper and lower crankshaft bearings. Then install the crankshaft on the journals. Apply the specified amount of sealer directly in the groove of the block to the bed plate mating surface. Note that the block assembly surface must be free of contamination prior to applying the sealer. Install the lower crankcase. Tap it gently into place with a suitable tool if necessary. Ensure it is aligned properly with the dowels. Note that the lower crankcase must be installed within 20 minutes of applying the sealer. Following the proper sequence, install the new crankshaft bearing bolts finger tight and then torque to specification. Using the angle meter, tighten the bolts in sequence an additional 70 degrees. Finally, tighten the lower crankcase perimeter bolts in sequence to specification. Note that the bolts must be fastened to final specification within 60 minutes of the sealer application. Remove the excess sealer from the seal recess. Next, install the new bearing inserts into the connecting rod and connecting rod cap. Install the specified connecting rod guides into the connecting rod bolt holes to protect the crankshaft journal during piston and connecting rod installation. Stagger each piston ring end gap equally around the piston. Place the piston in its matching bore. The piston must be installed so that the mark on the top of the piston faces the front of the engine. Hold the specified piston ring compressor against the engine block. Tap the piston into its bore with a hammer handle. Guide the connecting rod to the connecting rod journal while tapping the piston into place. Continue tapping until all the rings have entered the cylinder bore. Install the connecting rod caps, ensuring the cap is properly oriented on the connecting rod. Install new connecting rod bolts and tighten to specifications. Measure the connecting rod side clearance with a feeler gauge to ensure it is within specification. Next, install the cylinder head gasket to the block. Before the head is installed on the engine, be sure to clean and inspect the cylinder head. Start by removing the valves with the specified tool to compress the spring. Remove the valve keys, then the retainer and spring. Using the appropriate special tool, remove and discard the valve seals. Do not damage the valve guide. Remove any burrs that have formed at the key groove with an oil stone or file. Remove the valves. Inspect the valves for nicks, burrs, scratches, or any other signs of excessive wear. Ensure the valve stem clearance is within specification. After cleaning the head, install new valve seals and the spring. Then install the special tool to compress the spring and install the retainers and keys. Using a straight edge and feeler gauge, inspect the cylinder head and block deck surface for flatness. Ensure the number 1 cylinder is at top dead center or TDC. The key on the crankshaft should be on the top in the 12 o'clock position. Then install the cylinder head and new cylinder head bolts and tighten to specifications in sequence. Next,